part of the Commons. We're in downtown Hamilton. We're a sister church within Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, so it is good to be with extended family, and that's amazing. I like to start most things with a disclaimer. Before you start talking about what things are going to be, it's nice to say just right off the bat what things aren't. And so the first thing is I'm not an expert. A year ago, I was at your retreat, and I was telling some stories about community, and coming back today, that verse passage that was just read, I'm not going to unpack all of that. We're going to take a little bit of it. Mostly what I'm going to do is tell stories. And so when you start telling stories, you can be confused as being an expert. And I'm not an expert. I just got stories to tell. And so don't treat me as an expert. To be honest, most of my friends would say I can often be a jerk. So we can just say I'm not an expert at all. And the Commons isn't an expert at all. We are a broken group of people, and like any collection of people, we get by on a lot of grace. The one thing that we come close to in expertise, or at least have a lot of permission to do, is we give ourselves a lot of permission to experiment, and we seem to build relationships with people that are also giving themselves permission to experiment. And so we get to hold some stories that are maybe a little different, maybe they're not, but we feel like we have permission to try things. So that is our anywhere coming close to expertise. That's about it, is permission to try stuff. Stories, I don't think they're intended to be copied. They're intended to spark imagination. And so every story has a context, and it's a context that if I tell a story that happened in Hamilton, it's a context that's different here. The part that's shared is the values behind the story, and maybe some of the permission to experiment, and maybe that sparks a story that's already started here, or maybe it sparks a new story, and that's great too. But it's not about transplanting contexts, it's about sparking imagination. And so that's really what we're trying to do today. And if none of that happens, a good story is a good story all on its own. I think the idea of foolish things and weak things, that these are the things that God uses, it's actually perfect for this season of Lent that we're in. The cross is probably the most foolish community building tool in the world. Community with God and community with other built on someone being nailed to a cross is a very foolish plan. I don't think it's in anyone's best practices model, and God used it. And so all these stories I'm going to bring into the context of what's wisdom and what's foolishness, and that's how we're going to tie into our passage. So if we can get my first slide. So wisdom is building up a strong organization or brand, and foolishness is jumping onto someone else's bandwagon and letting them get all the credit. So the Commons, we're part of something in Hamilton called True City, and it's great to be part of a denomination where you have a lot of shared values and history and theology and all those things. But sometimes we don't share geography, we don't share neighbors. And so True City is a group of churches in Hamilton, and this list is just the core churches that are sort of officially signed on. There's a bigger list of churches that are journeying alongside, and they work together, and they tell stories together, and they sometimes share resources, and they get together for a big party every year called the True City Festival. And the reason it works, even though it's a wide group of churches, is because we share neighbors and we share geography. And so some of the stories I'm going to be telling kind of touch on True City. So I just wanted, if I say True City, it's this sort of interchurch thing that's not quite a ministerial, and it's not a denomination. It's somewhere in between these two things, but it's churches from different backgrounds in relationship with each other. Let's get the next slide. So at the True City festival that I was just at, the thing that kept getting hammered in story after story to me, and it was something that I'd love to bring to other people, is this idea that a win for one piece of the kingdom is a win for the whole kingdom. And I personally need to start holding on to that, not just in my head, but that I need to feel it more. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. But the idea that a win for one piece of the kingdom is a win for the whole kingdom. And so the first story I want to tell you isn't about my church. It's about New Hope Church, which started this thing called New Hope Community Bikes. And they're a reformed, Christian Reformed church. They were planted by a bunch of Dutch people, and they started this little church plant called New Hope, and New Hope didn't have a building, and they're trying to decide what does church look like in their neighborhood, and a bunch of them were into bikes. And so they said, well, maybe a way we can connect to our neighborhood is we're going to go to the farmer's market, and we're just going to set up free bike repairs. And so they started doing little tune-ups on people's bikes, and then people started donating bike parts so that they could fix people's bikes and switch out inner tubes for kids and all these things. And all of a sudden they had so many bike parts they needed to open a bike shop. And so all of a sudden New Hope Church has New Hope Community Bikes, and they're like, well, now we got all these tools and parts, maybe we should invite people in to teach them how to fix their bikes. And so then they became a bike co-op, and you could become a member, and you could have a mentor, and they would teach you how to fix your own bike. And all these great relationships started, and people would come to the bike shop, and they'd stay for a church potluck, or somebody would come for a church potluck and realize that they have someone that can help them fix their bikes. And there was all this crossover happening for this church, and they got to own it, and it even shared names. And then the government said, this doesn't make sense on your income tax type stuff. Are you a church or are you a bike shop? And they had problems. And so they decided that they would become New Hope Church and New Hope Bike Co-op. And the co-op actually even outgrew the space that they shared with the church, and they just moved across the street. They could see each other from their windows of where the two places meet. And when that happened, all of a sudden, some of the discipleship and mentoring just for some reason didn't happen quite as much. That they noticed that kids would come in, they'd get their bikes fixed, but they weren't being connected to anything bigger. They'd get co-op students in, but they weren't really connecting with anyone at the church. There were still volunteers from the church at the bike shop. There were still people from the bike shop attending the church, but something didn't go right. And then a friend of a friend was talking about planting another church, and he was also into bikes. And he is a Baptist. And so he ended up being a bike mechanic there for a while, and he said, would you guys want to have Bible studies in the bike shop? Yeah, that'd be amazing. We've been thinking about that. And this whole other thing, Restoration Ministries started, where they're restoring bike mechanics. It's discipleship for bike mechanics. And all of a sudden, you had a Baptist church sending a pastor into a bike shop that has Christian Reform roots, and the Christian Reform church plant is saying that's okay, and they're all sharing what's happening, and they're sharing the young people that are coming into the shop and finding community in a bike shop, and then they find that they're attending church on a Friday night in a bike shop. And it's okay that it's really messy, and it's okay that nobody owned it. It's okay that one group came in and said, can we come help with this thing that you have your sign on? And it got muddled, but all of a sudden people were connecting again, and they were being discipled, and they were building relationships, and it was a healthier community again. And I don't know who owns it from these three different organizations, but it's happening. And there is good things happening, and a win for the one piece of the kingdom is a win for the whole kingdom. Wisdom for most folks is a car. Foolishness is a bike. Really, it is. I get yelled at sometimes. So let's get the next slide. When I'm on my bike, I sometimes have people in cars yelling at me. So I gave up my car last year. And so we've been trying creative ways of moving stuff around by bikes. And sometimes I get to borrow cars, and that's great. And sometimes we rent cars and all those things. But a lot of the time we get around on bikes. And it's just, I can tell why God would use this bike shop, because there's things that just happen when you make funny decisions. Doesn't mean that everyone has to get rid of their car and have a bike. I'm just lucky enough that in Hamilton we have a lot of bike infrastructure. But what I found out when I made this silly idea and it's mostly my wife's credit that she decided that we shouldn't have a car anymore, and I just go along with her good ideas. But good things started to happen to us. We had people in the True City Network, not even from our own church, from other churches, phone me up and say, "Oh, I saw that you got rid of your bike. We saw the post on your website, and we have an extra car that I often don't use on the weekends. Do you want to borrow it?" They don't owe anything to me. We're friends, but we hardly see each other because we're in different churches, and all of a sudden, there was opportunities for generosity and sharing. The biggest thing I saw was how the secular bike community all of a sudden was part of my community, and they were starting to build in to my family's life. So this fancy bike up here, which I don't even remember what it's called, but it's like a big shopping cart on the front of a bike in the top corner. It costs like $5,000 to get one of those bikes. That's why I don't own one. But my friend who is part of the cyclist community, who is my friend now, but when I first got rid of my bike, he was just a friend of a friend of a friend, and he heard that I had gotten rid of our car, and he's like, "You need to know what bikes can do." And he was really excited about this. And so he, through a friend of a friend of a friend, got in contact to me and says, "I want you to borrow my big cargo bike." And I'm like, "Oh, it's okay. I don't need to borrow." "No, you have to know what bikes can do." It was important to him. We were part of the same community now. We both didn't have a car. And he wanted me to borrow his super expensive bike. And so for a week, I bombed my kids around Hamilton in the front of this bike, just so you know how much you can carry. I actually put some adults in the front of that bike, and we bombed around in that as well. It's harder to pedal, but you could still do it. And he just wanted to know that I knew what bikes could do. And so all of a sudden, because I'd made a foolish decision, I had people in my community that I didn't have before. Another friend had another bike transportation company, and he loaned me this cart to lug stuff around on the back of my bike. And so just people were investing in me because now we had a shared purpose that had nothing to do with church and had nothing to do with wisdom, but had a lot to do with crazy ways of lugging stuff around on bikes. If we can get the next slide there. This is Bethany Gospel Chapel. They're around the corner from where I live. They are a Brethren church, the type of Brethren church where they don't employ pastors. It's just led by their elder team, and they don't have generally paid pastors. Sometimes they'll have paid staff. This Brethren church was really progressive because the big guy in the back, Graham, he is not their youth pastor. He is their youth pastor, but he is not their youth pastor because they don't have pastors. But they hired someone to do full-time kids and youth ministry at their church as an outreach to their community and something for their own kids. And they're part of this True City thing too, and they're around the corner from me. Wisdom is to build up really great programs for your own kids. Foolishness is taking care of other people's kids, even other church kids, on your own dime. So at the Commons, there's only 3 kids at our church, and they all belong to me. So we don't have any other kids. And sometimes we try to do programs for them, and sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't. And sometimes we try really hard to make gatherings intergenerational, and sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't. And we end up using Bethany Gospel Chapel's youth groups for our kids. It has worked. And now we didn't get this idea from ourselves. There's a BIC church plant called Greenhouse that we're friends with, and they only have a little bit of kids too. 2 families have kids, and they decided that they were going to send their kids to Bethany to be part of their kids programs and youth group. And so I could have looked for a church that was maybe a little bit closer to us in style or theology, and I thought about that. But then I also thought about this church that was just around the corner from us, and we thought, you know what? Wouldn't it be amazing if my kids could walk to youth group, even though they're very different from us, even though it's not Anabaptist in in any way, but I already had a relationship a little bit with their youth leader. And we had both spent some time working at the same youth outreach for street youth. And so I knew him a little bit. And I came to him and I said, you know what? We're trying to find a youth group for our kids. And we're thinking of yours, but I have one concern. And his church, all their elders are men. And I was like, I just feel weird sending my daughter to a youth group where all the elders are men. I'm worried I know that you probably aren't talking about like leadership stuff at youth group, and I already know that you're a good person and I worked with you the other place, but I keep thinking, what if somebody just happens to tell my daughter that she couldn't become a pastor someday? And that's bugging me. And he laughed and he said, we would never tell your daughter that she couldn't become a pastor. We don't think anyone should become pastors. And it was like, it's not like all of a sudden there's a resolution that I'm like, I think that your board is perfect because you just said that. But it was fine. It's like, of course, we're so different, but we have so much in common. And so we sent our kids there. Now, an interesting thing happened when I let go of, this doesn't have to be just like our church. It doesn't have to be the perfect youth group. It's just the youth group that's closest to us, and we have friends that are going. My daughter started inviting friends from her class, and lots of kids started coming because they could all walk. And so they all would end up going to the same youth group. And she's in a leadership program at her school. And one of the teachers was trying to get the leaders in this peer leadership program to do something on a Tuesday night. That's when youth group happens. And he's asking my daughter Zoe, no, sorry, I can't. I got something on Tuesday night. So goes down the list trying to get somebody to do this leadership thing. Going down all these leaders in this class. And they're all like, oh, no, sorry, I have a prior commitment on Tuesday night. I have a prior commitment on Tuesday night. All these grade 7 students have a prior commitment on Tuesday night. And the teacher's exasperated. He's like, what on earth do you all do on Tuesday night? We all go to the same youth group. What we didn't know was Bethany had been praying for neighborhood kids to come to their youth group. They had had a history of being a neighborhood youth group. The reason that they could justify hiring someone to do their youth group in a tradition that doesn't hire people to do things was because they wanted to reach out to their neighbors. And they had been doing that for years, and their cohort of kids had graduated out and grown up and gone to other places. And they were like, we feel like we're supposed to be connected to our youth, like our neighborhood, and that we're supposed to do this not just for our own kids, but for kids who live in this neighborhood. But they didn't have any connections left. They had moved on. And all of a sudden, kids from my church, kids from this church Greenhouse, actually kids from the New Hope Church that I talked about in the first story, there was families that all sent their kids into this youth group who all went to the schools that were across the street from the church. And their friends came. And all of a sudden their prayer was answered and were built into the story. And so we don't own this program. It's not the joint Bethany, Greenhouse, Commons youth group. It's their youth group. And our kids get to come. But a win for the kingdom is a win for the whole kingdom. When you get one piece that has a win, God answers prayer, it's good for all of us. If we can get the next slide up there. I don't mind if the slide stays up. I don't know how your projector works, but if it goes to sleep, that's fine too. All right, this slide is from our Advent gatherings this year, and we are doing something called a table liturgy. So instead of having communion as part of gathering, communion becomes a meal and the meal becomes the gathering. And so this Advent, because we're so small and our friends from Greenhouse are so small, we decided it would be neat to do Advent together. So we decided that we would join our gatherings together. Greenhouse, they meet on a Tuesday, we meet on a Sunday. They were really gracious and decided that they would meet on Sunday night with us. And that was amazing. But we were really trying to do this as a joint thing. And so for all of Advent, we joined together. And one thing that we had been doing this year is these table liturgies. And so we wanted to do that with Greenhouse. Now, the interesting thing, though, is this table liturgy, using a meal as communion and communion as a gathering, we didn't invent this idea. We met Stuart and Alex. Did anyone go to last year's annual church gathering? Is there anybody who was that? So we got one person who know who Alex and Stuart are. They're from the Anabaptist Network in the UK, and they came and spoke to tons of Mennonite people at the annual church gathering, and they did a little tour as well as part of Mennonite Church Canada, telling stories of what Anabaptism looks like in a UK context. And so we connected really well with these people, and we were lucky enough to be able to have conversations with them. And they were telling us about these things that their churches in their networks were doing called this table liturgy, where gathering really was a meal. And we're very interested in that, and we asked them about that. And said, could you just send us, like, what does a table liturgy look like for you guys? Could you email us what you're using? And right away, they emailed us a bunch of documents. Alex especially, she said, well, I know a number of churches that do this, and my church do this, and I'll just send you everything I have on my computer. And they sent it to me, and we chose this one table liturgy that was called the Child-Centered Table Liturgy, where either a child or a kid at heart reads all the questions and one part of the liturgy, and someone else reads some of the answers. It becomes a little bit like a catechism, and you do it as a meal. And so we got given this, and we reworked it, and we emailed back, and we said, thank you so much, and where did you find this? And what happened was, there was a church who wrote a table liturgy, who gave it to a church for free, who reworked a table liturgy, who gave it to a church, who gave it to Alex, who emailed it to me, where we reworked it, and no money changed hands, nobody owned it. Can't even tell from the document who owned it, because it's just a Word file that keeps getting sent around, and people keep editing and using in different contexts. And then at Advent, we got to introduce it to Greenhouse. And for some reason, the Lutherans down the corner from us, they decided to show up, and they got to have the table liturgy shared with them. And so all of a sudden, this Word file that gets emailed from the other side of the world and had already gone through a couple communities and been edited by these couple communities gets sent to us and gets passed on to other communities. And wisdom would be to copyright this really good idea and put it in a book and sell it. Foolishness is giving it away to anyone who wants to use it and letting them edit it and mess with it and make it be their own and mess with the stuff that you worked so hard on to get perfect for your community, and all of a sudden somebody else is getting their hands into it and making it for their community and taking maybe a little bit of credit where we can't even tell where one person started and another ended on who's touched this document anymore, because it's had so many different revisions. And it's just owned by the church. And it's good. And a win for the kingdom is a win for the whole kingdom. Next slide. So I'm a bit of a synth nerd. I like playing synthesizers and electronic music and experimental music. It's something that I get really excited about. But wisdom is to make music that lots of people like, so maybe you could make a living at it, or at least have people like what you're playing. Foolishness is making noise with obsolete synthesizers that a handful of people like, and maybe not even your own friends or family think that it's listenable music. That's foolishness. So this year we started something called Synth Social, and by us, it's not the Commons. There's a couple folks from the Commons, but there's a couple folks from a church called Eucharist, another True City church, and they have some folks that like synthesizers, and they were talking about, you know what, we have all this gear, a bunch of us own these synthesizers, and sometimes we go and see each other's bands, but we never really get to just sit around and talk about the gear and teach each other how to use it, and we know there's lots of people out there that are interested in this music, and by lots, there's probably another 30 people that like this stuff, and they don't have a community. They're doing it all by themselves, and they're just sort of toiling away in basements and attics, doing their thing, but they don't ever have a chance to get together and talk. Maybe when we're at shows, we get to go and say, good job, I really like your gear, but you don't ever get to talk shop and hang out and just be a group of people who like these kind of synthesizers. It's not the same as drum circles. Drum circles, if you all have like a hand drum, you can at least get together in the park and join in and start drumming. Electronic musicians have to like bring their amp and their speaker and their PA and all their cords. You have to make sure you're not going to blow a fuse with all this gear, and so they don't get together in the park doing this kind of stuff. And so the idea was that we would have a synth social. We set up a whole long bunch of dining room table stuff and said, just bring your synth, plug it in. We're going to walk around and try out each other's instruments and talk about what we're using and just hang out. And we did that. So successful, we did a second one. And we're in the room and we're talking to people, and we don't know these people who show up into my friend's house, because some of the people, they were on our email list, but some people found out from the Facebook group, and some people found out from a friend of a friend, and people were phoning saying, hey, I'm from McMaster University, I like synths, can we come? Yeah, sure. And we're talking to people and having these little conversations, and all of a sudden, there's this aha moment for a couple of us that half the people in the room are from different churches, and half the people in the room have no church affiliation at all. They might come from a different religious tradition, or maybe church has not been something that's part of their life, and we're connecting over synthesizers. And there's no end goal. We don't have a plan where like we do 3 synth socials and then we do synth worship night. It's just its own thing. But there are people making connections, meeting people from churches across Hamilton, and they don't know it, but they're building relationships, and they're seeing ways of being community and not even knowing what's different yet. And we don't know where this goes, but we know it's good. And what I would like you to think is it doesn't matter what your hobby or interest or community circle is. There is ways for people to have wins for the kingdom for the weirdest of things. It's just true. Bikes, synthesizers, quilting, cooking classes. It doesn't matter soccer, like it doesn't matter what the thing is. If you're invested in it and you're excited about it, people will rally around that as community. There's some of the people in this group, we were part of an experimental music series that a couple of us were from a church. Most of the people were just from the experimental music scene. And it's a very lonely scene. Experimental musicians often aren't even a band. It's usually 1 or 2 people, and there's a very isolated thing about it, and sometimes even a very dysfunctional thing about it, that you have people coming from a wide variety of backgrounds that maybe aren't the most socially functional people in the world, and they're putting together this music series. And just by having a couple people who were pastors or leaders in their church just be inserted in this group, we started to notice that we were doing pastoral care for experimental musicians. We were making sure that people had groups to help them move when they got kicked out of their apartment last minute. We made sure that there was peacemaking happening when there was a philosophical debate between the validness of this kind of experimental music and this other kind of experimental music, and you're objectifying other cultures, and you're just white privilege, and there was all this heated debates, and that needed peacemaking happening. And all of a sudden, just because we were inserted into this, there was pastoral care happening. And they didn't realize that pastoral care was happening. They didn't realize that they had a pastor now. All they knew is that this synth thing, this experimental music thing, was doing something different than it had done before. And so there was a win for the kingdom in that. And so I don't know what networks and what communities, what churches around the corner from where you live, what stuff is happening, what your neighbors are, but there are opportunities that aren't part of the Mennonite banner, or aren't part of the local church banner, or official programs that are just kind of bubbling under the surface. And I would just encourage you to think about that. And if there's stuff that you have been working on, you're like, I feel like I get a lot of life when I'm in this other community, but it doesn't look a lot like church. And I would just say that that's okay. You don't have to try to justify that or validate that. It's okay to see where things go and to play a little bit. God's a creative God, and I don't think that God is upset when we get to play. I think God's really excited. I remember hearing a story once when God created flowers, and I don't know if this is true or not, it could just be apocryphal. He didn't create flowers and all of a sudden there was a million flowers in the world. That each time he created a flower, and like a little child, he said, do it again. He gets excited about play. God likes it when something happens and is willing to be joyful in little playful things, in creating something new, in stepping into something again and again that brings us joy. And that's okay. And so maybe it seems like foolishness, but God loves foolishness. And so I would just encourage you to think about those things. I'm so happy that we get to be in community with you folks. You actually shared a really great gift with us, our friend Pat Power. You were able to send her to Hamilton, and we are so happy that you let her come move into our neighborhood. She actually just lives a couple blocks down from me. We share the same library, so we're very, very close to where each other lives. And she did a foolish thing when she first moved. She didn't know me other than at that winter retreat. And I don't even think she had seen my driving habits or not. But she was going on vacation quickly after she moved to Hamilton, and she lent me her car right away. That's foolishness, Pat. You shouldn't lend cars to strangers. Foolishness. And my kids got to see that we were without a car and we were still trying to figure out what that meant for us as a family. And I don't remember even what it was, but there was stuff that we needed to do that week that we weren't sure how we were going to do it yet because we hadn't figured out all our crazy bike and rental car ways. And all of a sudden they saw that we didn't know what we were going to do one week, and all of a sudden everything just worked out because God provided a car one week. And so foolishness helped my kids see an answer to prayer. And it's just amazing how those things happen. I would love it if you guys would think of us when you're having your own prayer times. Some stuff that we're doing. We're sponsoring a refugee family, just like lots of Mennonite churches are sponsoring refugee families. It seems like foolishness to us, though, because like we're 15 people on a Sunday sometimes. There's only 25 people in our network. Not all those people have jobs. It's kind of foolish for us to be sponsoring a refugee family. But some neighbors met a newcomer family that has the oldest brother still in a refugee camp, and it seemed like the right thing to do, and we stepped into that. And a lot of the money got raised by grants and other churches who had raised too much money, and they gave it to us. Now we have a much more manageable size, but we stepped into it. Little churches shouldn't be sponsoring refugees. Pray for us. We got $6,000 left to raise, which seems like a lot of money to us. We're working on developing some leadership policies and procedures. The good thing about not having a lot of policy or procedure is it gives us permission to experiment, but we need to actually have our own not-for-profit status someday, and so we need to work on those things. And we'd appreciate your prayers because it's not what we're good at. We're tiny. We're a tiny little church, and we don't need to be a mega church. But we think 30 people on a Sunday is a sustainable number, and so we just would ask that you would pray that we would just sort of double, which sounds like if you're 100 and you're doubling, that sounds like a very bold prayer, but when you're 15, doubling, I think, is very reasonable. We want to see 30 people in our community really active. And we'd even be so bold that maybe one other family would think it's okay to come to a church that doesn't have a kids program. And so, think of us in your prayer time, and we would really appreciate that. And maybe we'd see God do something foolish.